Hi, this is Marlene, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Whether you're watching a video or listening to a podcast, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. Links to videos or MP3 files can be found on MiamiGhostChronicles.com. Go to MarlenePardo.com for information on new book releases. I narrate several podcast series that can be found on major podcast platforms and can also be listened to via Alexa, Sonos, and other home systems. Look for Supernatural Storytime for scary storytelling, Nightshade Diary for classic horror and adventure stories, Stories of the Supernatural for interviews with different guests on the show. If you want to get noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird, you can visit Strange Than Fiction Stories tab at MiamiGhostChronicles.com or find us on Blogspot. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. How's everybody doing today? Good? I'm good. Thankfully. Crazy stuff going on. We're getting to that part of the year, my favorite part of the year. Besides my birthday being in October, it's Halloween time. So, as a matter of fact, I dived headfirst into commercialism, which is there's already a bunch of Halloween and autumn stuff and even some Thanksgiving things. And it was like, oh, well, you know, it's technically still a few months ago. But so I said, why not? So I already bought some of my Halloween decorations for outside. And I bought a couple of, I'm still not done. I'm debating how far I want to go with this. I bought a couple of, they're like Grim Reaper kind of things, you know, that you could hang up outside and they blow in the wind. And we're considering it. We wanted to do one of those big giant, we were looking at a dragon skeleton. And when it's like, okay, yeah, but after Halloween is over, where do you put it? You know, that kind of stuff that you think about. But yeah, since once we moved, I got rid of all my old Halloween stuff because it was too much to carry. So I gave it away. I donated very few things. So basically I'm starting from scratch. And out here, I've got a lot of area. And out here, believe it or not, it's perfect because a lot of my trees out here are oaks with a lot of that Spanish moss hanging down. It's like perfect setting for Southern Gothic with a with a really cheaply made gauzy Grim Reaper floating underneath it. What can I say? But anyway, and as to the what's going on with the Chicken Kingdom this week took a detour. Because I don't know, in prior episodes I mentioned I had a guinea hen. She finally, which by the way, I had two guineas. A little baby, the female, I brought up with some chickens because I got her just hatched. And she got along with chickens. And then without researching, I got a white male that he bullies everybody. He runs everybody ragged. Everybody, I mean, the roosters, you name it. But anyway, she finally went into between the roots of one of the big oaks and had a bunch of eggs. She hatched them. Two of the babies died. I've got three left. And believe it or not, let's see, because I did some research that they're really not good parents, especially out in the wild. They kind of leave their chicks behind. Their chicks are very, very small. And the rest of the eggs that she just walked away from, I put them under a broody hen. So if she takes them over, that'll be even better. So yeah, Marlene went to the guinea hen detour. I'm going to keep them all, by the way, because if any of you are familiar with guineas, they make great, weird noises. Yes. Now, a word about our sponsor. Our sponsor is Freethinker Projects, and they are providing services Florida-based for people, nomad lifestyle, RVers, people that go from area to area, but they want some place either to receive and then forward their mail or packages to them, or they need to keep a permanent address here in the state of Florida for the residency, they can provide that service for you. Okay, this is not like a P.O. box or one of these mail places, which doesn't allow that. This is an actual physical address, and they provide virtual mailbox service, which means when they receive mail and or packages, they scan it, either the envelope or the contents, depending on what you want, and let you know immediately via email. And then depending on your instructions, they either shred it or forward it. Some people have things forwarded once a week, whatever you want. And again, the good thing about this is also they receive all size packages, so you don't have to worry. You know, a lot of people get things stolen. Where they have the receiving, it's fenced in. Plus, they take it in immediately. So basically, even if you're in the area, they will keep it safe for you until you're ready to pick it up. They also have online notary services, which means you can be in any part of the country and you can notarize a document if that's what you need. And they also provide registered agent services for anyone wanting to incorporate here in the state of Florida, or if you already have an agent, a registered agent, but you want to switch. Maybe their rates are less. I believe it's only $35 a year. That's a great rate, by the way, for a registered agent service. Look them up. It's freethinkerprojects with an S at the end.com, freethinkerprojects.com. And there you can review all their services. You know, they have a lot of things that can help you out, especially if you're one of those lucky people that just roams around the country. But anyway, let's get on to the good part. The good part is who our guest is for tonight. This is the first time he's been here. And his name is Dr. Elliott Van Dusen. He's been fascinated with both the supernatural and law enforcement since childhood. He graduated from St. Mary's University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in criminology. He completed 15 years of service with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police before retiring at the rank of corporal. He spent his policing career specializing in major crimes, homicide, sex crimes, and drug enforcement. He currently serves as a director of paranormal phenomena research and investigation. He earned a diploma in parapsychology from the Stratford Career Institute, a doctorate degree in parapsychology from the American International University, and has taken additional parapsychological training from the Nova Scotia Community College, University of Edinburgh's Kessler Parapsychology Unit, Ryan Education Center, and the University of Ottawa. He is currently completing his Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology degree from Yorkville University. His parapsychological work has been featured on the Discovery Channel, the Globe and Mail, the Daily News, the Chronicle Herald, and several podcasts and radio stations. He wrote and published his first professional book in May of 2018, titled Evil in Exeter, based on a true story and investigation he conducted into one Rhode Island's family's terrifying haunting. You know, we're going to ask him about that, right? And on September of 2020, almost a year ago exactly, his second book, Supernatural Encounters, True Paranormal Accounts from Law Enforcement, was released, and he just told me that next month he's about to come out with book 2 of that series. Help me welcome Elliott. How are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you?
Great. Fantastic. Obviously, it looks like, you went into law enforcement. And how did you ever get interested in the paranormal? Was it childhood experience or what happened?
I was always interested in both, actually. I was always fascinated by the paranormal, always wanted to be a police officer. And I always credit the television show Unsolved Mysteries to getting me involved in the paranormal. Yeah, because, Unsolved Mysteries talked a lot about cold case homicide investigations, which I found interesting. And then, of course, it had the supernatural element to it, ghost sightings, UFO sightings. So then when X-Files came out, I thought that was really cool. There was 2 law enforcement officers that investigate the paranormal. So that kind of made me want to get involved in investigating the paranormal. I ended up moving from Sydney to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and my mom came to me one day and found a newspaper article. And it said that there was a local parapsychologist teaching at the Nova Scotia Community College. And that's where I met my colleague, Daryl Walsh. We were colleagues and friends still to this day, but I took 2 of his courses. And after I completed them, he invited me to join his research organization, which was called the Center for Parapsychological Studies in Canada. And that's where I started to get involved with field investigations. And then I got recruited by the RCMP, and learned very quickly that you don't talk about the paranormal in this police force. I have talked to other police officers, and they've been well recepted, but then I have talked to a few others that have had kind of the same issues I did. Ended up becoming much like Fox Mulder in the fact that his
Right, it's a career killer, is what you're saying.
Yes, they I would get ridiculed for it, but then towards when I knew I was kind of getting ready to retire, probably the last 2 years of law enforcement, I didn't care. I started kind of doing things publicly again, going on some podcasts, writing some articles and things like that. So I kind of just stopped caring about what other people think. And then now that I'm retired, I retired in May 2020. Now I just do this full time.
Exactly. I've spoken to so many first responders, police officers, you name it, pilots. I mean, people that you're supposed to be very objective, and as a matter of fact, which sometimes are the best witnesses, and they'll tell you some stories that you'll be like, wow, but they'll say, yeah, but I never talk about that because forget it. Then you become that guy, and it will follow you around. Now it's even more mainstream, but even so, you never want to be that guy or that girl, whatever. That's because people remember 5 years, 10 years later that, I've spoken to a lot of people because of that. And I've even interviewed police officers who have had to do it anonymously.
Yes. Yeah. And I find that's big. That's one thing that I offer when I wrote my first book, or I guess second book, but first book about law enforcement and the paranormal. When I wrote Supernatural Encounters, I had offered people to be anonymous, and I think one, being a law enforcement officer myself, and two, them knowing that I'm involved in the paranormal made them feel comfortable, but then also offering to change their name, possibly their police department if it's a smaller police department, the right. City. I've even had to create like a fake jail, for example, because the correctional officer said if the story came out, they would know that it came from me. So I think by doing that, it made people feel safe, and they came forward to, because I get a lot of my colleagues are like, that's amazing that you were able to talk to law enforcement officers and get those kind of stories, because just like you said, a lot of them keep it inside, or they don't really talk about it just because of the stigma that's attached to it. So the fact that I was able to put out a book like that with real stories from real law enforcement officers, and then be able to do it a second time, a lot of my colleagues do give me a lot of praise for that, and something I'm very proud of.
Yes, and it's really funny because one time I interviewed one, and it was a very small police department. They had a small station, and it was like one of those unacknowledged. Everybody knew that something was going on in that station, but it was like, and as a matter of fact, this police officer, she's a woman, and she told me that she used to one time, they would rotate. She would do like the midnight, the overnight. One time she came in and she found the dispatcher, because they only needed one dispatcher at a time, sitting outside with a radio dispatching from outside because of what she had heard inside the station. And she says, everybody's here has had some type of encounter, but everybody just like looks at each other. But then it's like, we can't talk about this too much, even though everybody had some type of experience, because it, like you said, it's like unofficially, officially, it's like, don't talk about that stuff. Kind of deal.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I've actually had law enforcement officers tell me a supernatural story, and they always started out by, I don't believe in this kind of stuff, and I'm not really sure what I saw, but I can't explain it. And then they tell you the story. So there's even some that can't even bring themselves to mentioning that it's an unknown or it's a supernatural event.
Right. And you know what? The ones usually, though, that experience it the most are usually those overnight, when everything is quieted down. Those are the ones that see a lot of stuff. And then it's really funny. But if you tell them, hey, well, I want you to stay out there by yourself, they'll be like, no, stuff like that.
Yes. Yeah. Very true.
It's really like exactly like what you just said. I don't believe in it. However, ...
You hear that quite a bit. It's interesting.
Right. No, you I don't know if you had any stories, Elliott, about officers coming up on a car accident and seeing somebody, most of the times, along with paramedics, they're like the first to arrive. And sometimes they've seen somebody standing there, or even among, how people will stop, like, people, regular people. Then they realize that one of the people they saw turns out to be one of the victims. But in that moment of excitement, they don't realize it because they're responding to a bad accident. And later on, they come to realize that one of the people they saw standing in that crowd is one of the victims. Did you ever have a story like that?
I've heard stories like that, but that story actually reminds me of one that'll be in the book coming out next month, More Supernatural Encounters. It took place in British Columbia, Canada. It was in an area where the RCMP police, and it was a snowy night. Roads were really bad, and a call of a single vehicle accident came in. So a female police officer took the call, and she made her way to the scene. She said the roads were really bad, full of slush, and the car was sliding. She eventually got to the scene, and she could see some damage. She saw some parts of the vehicle on the road, and so she figured it was, going to be a fairly bad accident. But when she got closer to where the car was in the ditch, she realized it was another police vehicle. And so she got out of the car and ran down, and she realized it was her partner and her friend, actually. Wow. He was driving on the road, I guess, and the vehicle lost control and ended up crashing into the ditch. So he was unconscious. So paramedics are on their way to the scene. She said, ironically, a doctor had stopped, seen the car accident, stopped, got out, and identified himself as a medical doctor. And he went and checked the police officer, and he said that he was gone and that there's nothing you could do for him. So paramedics showed up, and they were able to get the body out of the vehicle and put it into the ambulance and head off to the hospital. They were actually able to resuscitate the police officer and bring him back to life. So he was in the hospital for quite a while, as you can imagine, recovering from his injuries. And one day, the female police officer that had first attended the scene was off duty, and she got a knock at the door, and it was her partner that had come from the hospital. He was out now, but he needed a walker and things like that. He was still pretty rough shape, and his wife, and they had come over to thank her for everything that she had done the night of the accident. And as they're in their living room, he starts telling her that he saw everything, and she said, well, what do you mean? Like, when I got to the scene, you were unconscious in the car. And he said that he was floating above his body, so he could see almost like a bird's eye view. He could see the police car. He could see her come on scene, her get out and run to the car and check him, and the medical doctor say that he was dead. And he basically recounted the whole scene that had taken place. And she couldn't believe it, but she was able to confirm a lot of what he said because she was there and saw it all. And I thought that was a really cool story. Unfortunately, he is still alive, which is great, but unfortunately, because of that car accident, he still has a lot of cognitive issues. So I wasn't able to interview him. He actually doesn't even remember that incident.
Okay, he had brain trauma.
Yeah, he had brain trauma. So it makes the story for me even a little bit cooler because it's something that could have been lost. You know what I mean? If we hadn't heard that story, because the guy has severe brain injuries from the accident, doesn't remember it anymore. So we would have never heard of this near-death experience. But luckily, he was able to tell his partner shortly after it happened. And that was something that had always stuck with her. So when she found out I had written the first book, she contacted me and reached out to me. So I have had that, and there was one other story that a female police officer and friend of mine, so I personally know her, had told me. She said she used to go out and assist the traffic reconstructionists, and their jobs are to go to all the serious accidents or the fatals and reconstruct the scene. They use lasers and take measurements and all that stuff, lots of detailed photographs. So she would volunteer to assist with this unit because she had an interest in it. And she said one time, again, it was winter. There was a single vehicle accident, but it was a fatal. So the driver was killed. She went out to assist the RCMP officer with taking the measurements. And she said when she was in the vehicle searching around for, the police will search for cell phones and any sign of alcohol or drugs to see if that contributed to the accident. She said something grabbed the back of her shoulder, and she could tell it was a hand. So she thought it was the RCMP officer telling her to do something or had a job for her. And when she turned around, there was absolutely nobody there. It was just her and the other police officer on scene.
Wow.
So she swears up and down that it was something that grabbed her. It wasn't, she didn't bang her shoulder on something. She said it was a distinct hand that touched her shoulder. So, obviously with, accident scenes and things like that, there's a lot of trauma and residual energy that can come from that. So it kind of makes sense that there would be some experiences at those types of scenes.
Of course. And, this is the thing that sometimes people don't realize that it's really funny that you mentioned that near-death experience, because nowadays they're able to resuscitate people that once upon a time would have just forget it. They died. There's before they would take you to the ambulance, would take you to the hospital. And if you made it, then lucky you. But now, we have paramedics and they've got all the drugs and stuff and CPR. So more and more people are having that near-death experience and able to retell it. And exactly like what you said, they're almost like an observer of what's taking place. And sometimes makes you wonder if maybe these people, when, like I said, that sometimes first responders will see somebody in the crowd that later on turns out to be one of the victims, is somebody that's there, but maybe their body is like, that's it. Their body cannot be resuscitated. It's beyond repair. And then they go on. But when they're standing there, they're like doing that observation thing. Like, I want to get back in there, back into my body. But it's not a question of CPR. They just can't. But yeah, I've heard of that quite often from first responders. I had that another police officer tell me where they had a house in a certain neighborhood, and there was a murder-suicide at the house. And this was a few years back when landlines were more common. They said that after the crime, the house was kept up, but it wasn't sold. It wasn't rented out. She says that they started to get 911 calls from that house. And when there's a landline, you can connect exactly to what the address is that it's originating from. And they even they've started thinking, okay, maybe somebody left a telephone, a live telephone line still in there. Sometimes they'll do that. And they even called up the phone company. And the phone company says, no, there's no active telephone service in that house, period. And after a while, they would get, she says, a couple of times, 2 or 3 times a week, they would get that 911 call originating from that house. And that, she says, it went on for like 3 or 4 years. And then little by little, it started spacing out more and more until it just went away. But, it always makes you think, what was going on there? How was that happening?
That's really interesting. I've heard other similar stories to that as well. In the book coming out next month, one police officer was getting 911 calls from a funeral home. And the only landline that was kind of in that building was in the morgue part where they did all the embalming and things like that. So, and she said the night that she got that 911 call from the funeral home, there was a worker there, and he said he didn't call it, and so she asked to come in and take a look. It's common law here in Canada. I'm not sure about the States, but that on 911 calls, the police are allowed to enter a building, a place, a residence without a warrant to search to make sure everyone's okay. So she went in, she checked the whole place. It was just the one worker there. There was no other phone lines except in the morgue. And she said it was like ironically located next to a deceased body that was there that was being embalmed. So she's not sure if it was just one of those things. I know during thunderstorms, we would always get multiple static 911 calls as a police officer. But she's not sure if it was that or,
Can you
was it
imagine? When
freshly
that call comes
deceased
in,
person
it's like,
trying to
who's
make a
going to
phone
take that
call?
call? It's like,
Yeah,
you're going, no, you're going. It's like, who's,
yeah,
wait, I think I'm going to pull a car over right now. I can't go on that call. It must have been nobody wanted.
yeah. That's pretty much the way she felt after attending that call.
Yeah, there's stuff like that it's like even the people that the ones that say I don't believe in that, but yeah, I'd
Yeah,
rather not find
exactly.
out
Yeah.
what's and and let me ask you, I've had a couple of officers and I've talked to that especially the ones that are involved in usually in some type of unit, whether it's homicide or assaults, violent crimes, where they have an instance where they think something's followed them home. Things start happening at their house. Have you had stories like that?
No, I haven't personally heard any stories similar to that. I could certainly see that.
Well,
Actually,
right. And the reason I bring it up is that I remember one time, this was like secondhand, an officer told me that the other officer had told him, where something like that happened. And for no reason, out of the blue. And I want to say, I can't remember if he was either gangs. I want to say either gangs or homicide, one of the two. I can't remember what, but he was in a unit. And all of a sudden, really weird things were happening in the house. And like, he had been living there a while. It was an apartment. And he started having these really dreams, like, I'm being chased, as an officer, one of those like nightmares, for lack of a better word. And he was pulling his hair out because he was one of those typical, he ignored it up to a certain point, but then it got so that he said he had gotten to the point where he didn't even want to go home. He just didn't want to go home to face whatever was going on. Shadows, he'd be watching TV, shadows, stuff crashing in his kitchen, out of sight, the nightmares. And that's the problem sometimes with people that say that they don't believe it, is asking for help, because they kind of like run into like, bottom line, to make a long story short, it turned out that apparently there was a criminal that he, for years, and I want to, it leads me to believe, I think he was in the gang unit, where him and this guy, he had put this guy away a couple of times. The guy was a very bad gang member, really bad guy. But they had like a real hate relationship going on for years. And I can't remember who was it, or either he saw something or something that he comes to find out that the guy had died or been killed or he died in jail. And it coincided exactly around the time that he started having these things happen in his apartment. And it was like, he didn't want to believe it, but it was like this guy after death was trying to still even the score. Bottom line, even though he got a blessing, he moved out of the apartment because he says in his head he couldn't handle that, how could you fight against somebody that's not is incorporeal? There's nothing there. So yeah, and that's why I asked you that if you had come across that, because sometimes it's like, sometimes those how do you, I imagine as a police officer or law enforcement, that's a difficult one to grapple with.
Yeah, well, it would be for sure. I mean, like, I've heard of cases and I've known police officers where the living have done that.
Yeah.
For example, gang unit members have to be careful because,
Yes.
if they're turning the heat on a gang, they can start to try and intimidate that police officer and his family. So, I mean, I know lots of police officers where criminals would show up at their home and try and intimidate them and intimidate their family. But yeah, to have to take that even a step further and have something supernatural follow you home, where we really don't have any control over that. Right. Even in parapsychology, we still don't really understand exactly what human consciousness is, or how it operates, because it obviously operates outside the known realm of physical science right now. But it's certainly possible that things can follow you home. I've dealt with it more, not from a law enforcement perspective, but we're actually working a case right now where a medium was trying to help somebody, and then all of a sudden now the medium is experiencing haunting characteristics that the client that she was trying to help was experiencing. And that's actually the second case that I've personally worked where this has happened. There was the case in Exeter actually. Where a medium was trying to help out, and whatever was at the house in Exeter started to harass not only the medium that was helping out, but also her teenage son. So certainly that's a risk with the supernatural when you're involved in that type of work, for sure.
Was it that a human or a non-human entity in that case? Did she know?
You know what? It was. I call it borderline because I'm not even sure. I do have an interest in demonology. Some things kind of led me to believe that it could have been demonic. Certain things did happen in threes, and there were lots of signs, that it could be a demonic haunting. But Haley had actually seen the entity herself manifest once before, and it had like a pale gray face. It's actually the book cover of the book. So what we did is Haley drew it out after she had seen the entity. It's a male, very tall male with a moon pale gray face and no eyes. Like they were just completely black. So the family was really good friends with Catholic priest that actually was an exorcist. He's on some paranormal shows, Father Bob Bailey. But he said that if it's not a demon or it's not demonic, then by description of that entity, it sounds like it's a damn soul, and the church would treat it the same way that it would treat the demonic. So it was either somebody really, really, really hateful, or it could have been demonic. But that's one that I still struggle with. I'm not 100% sure, but it was certainly a fascinating case.
And that was your first book, the one that you wrote about the Exeter, that family that had. And
yes.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? I mean, what happened with that family?
Yeah. So how I got involved is I met a girl on Instagram, and her photo kind of looked like Gillian Anderson from the X-Files. So I made a comment on it saying, "Hey, you kind of look like Gillian Anderson in this picture." And I got a private message, and she said, actually, I entered a competition with a magazine, and I won the top 10 Gillian Anderson lookalike. And she kind of sent the screenshot of it, and so that was kind of cool. And so we got talking about X-Files and got talking about the paranormal. I told her, I'm a police officer in Canada, but I used to investigate the paranormal, and I just kind of do it quietly, kind of thing. And then she told me that she's actually been around spirits her whole life, and that everywhere she's been has been haunted. And she said she was on the television show Ghost Hunters, and I actually found the episode, and the episode was exactly the same story she told me, and sounded like a really, really interesting person. So I decided to fly down there and meet her, and I stayed at a hotel, and we traveled around Rhode Island for the weekend. She took me to a bunch of really cool paranormal sites. I got to see the grave of Mercy Brown, who's a vampire, or alleged vampire in Exeter. Got to see the real Conjuring house in Harrisville, Rhode Island. Got to see the Devil's Footprint, which is in North Kingston. We actually had to find the GPS coordinates. Somebody luckily had blogged it because it's off the main highway and kind of into the woods a little bit, but we actually did manage to find it, which was really cool. And then the Stedeker House in Connecticut, which they made the movie about haunting in Connecticut.
Haunting in Connecticut, right.
Yeah, so I mean, New England is just like Nova Scotia, where I'm from. It's got a very haunted history. There's all kinds of great sites and stories. So I decided to go back and see her again, and this time she invited me to stay at her house. But she warned me, like, whenever she has a boyfriend or a boy or anything over to the house, that the activity seems to pick up. So I didn't think too much of it because, I'm a police officer and paranormal investigator. But sure enough, when I was there right off the bat, You'd see doors open and close on their own, lock and unlock on their own. Her children didn't sleep for 3 or 4 nights in a row because they said they heard scratching on the bedroom wall. And I went outside to make sure like tree branches weren't scraping against the window, or it wasn't, a squirrel or something on the windowsill. But there was nothing. You'd start to experience like physical characteristics. You'd get really tired, no matter how much you slept. I didn't feel this part, but Haley felt like she couldn't leave the house, or she didn't want to leave the house, and she kind of just wanted to isolate. And toys would be manipulated strange hours in the morning. You could hear the toys going off and not doing the normal things that they're supposed to do. It would kind of cut itself off, and just like strange things. Then all of a sudden, like house flies, almost like in the movie Amityville Horror, there was just like hundreds of these house flies that would just show up out of nowhere. Like the doors weren't left open, windows weren't left open. We actually had to go to the store at one point to buy those fly strips, and within like 30
Really?
seconds.
That bad?
It was that bad, yeah. And within seconds, like 30 seconds, the entire strip would be full of house flies. And it got so bad one time that we had to go to one of the Catholic churches and get some holy water. And so later that night, the fire alarm started to go off at like 1:30 in the morning. And they were the type of fire alarm that if one goes off, they all go off. And it's warning you that there's a fire in the house. So we checked the house first, obviously not thinking that it's paranormal, thinking that there's a fire. But there was nothing. And then the alarms wouldn't shut off unless they got splashed with holy water. And even then, only that one individual alarm would turn off, not the whole thing, even though they were connected. So the next day, we contacted Kitty, which was the brand that made the fire alarm, and they had no explanation for it, and basically sent out 1 or 2 free fire alarms to try and reinstall. But the house, I made multiple trips there over a period of a year, and every time I went, there was always something that I would see or hear or experience. I also saw doorknobs turn on their own, and I'd open it up and there'd be nobody on the other side. Heard footsteps approach me in threes. There was 3 distinct footsteps. Really, it was definitely the most haunted house I've ever worked.
Did she ever, what was the point of origin? Was it from the moment she moved in, or did something just trigger it?
So with this case, she's had 3 separate mediums, and she hasn't even sought them out. They always seem to contact her sister that has a message to pass along to her. But she was told by 3 separate mediums that she has the ability to be a medium. And she was very intuitive, but I guess she would have that skill set if she could develop it. So spirits are attracted to her and think that they can communicate with her and that she can help them. So she's always been around spirits no matter where she's at.
Okay.
It was in Cranston where she grew up. Then when she moved out on her own, every apartment she was ever in was haunted. And then this new home, it was nothing to do with like the age of it. It was actually a fairly new home and a fairly new subdivision. Okay. It's just the fact that these entities are attracted to her.
Okay, so it's one of those where the person is the haunted part. The person,
yes,
because I've been doing investigations since the 1990s, and this was way, of course, before the the paranormal reality shows, and it takes a while sometimes for when you start talking to people exactly about like when did this start. Then they start telling you that basically they have a personal history of phenomena going off around them, and it's like, okay, it's not the house, it's you. Yeah, and sometimes you might move into a house, but really it's you. And like you said, sometimes they do have mediumistic abilities, latent ones, or sometimes they do have an attachment that follows them around. It depends on what goes on with them. Sometimes people will see different things, and those are the ones that they don't know how to put up boundaries, so that the dead kind of like, hey, you can't come in have a conversation with me in the middle of the night. So what happened at the end? What happened?
Well, it got pretty scary towards the end. the young boy, 5 years old, started to, in my opinion, almost display some signs of possession.
Oh,
Especially looking back at, I took Dr. Karen O'Keefe's course from the School of
yes.
Parapsychology, Exorcism and Possession, and looking back at the case. I mean, he was certainly I personally think the early stages of possession. He started to not want to clean himself, so he was fighting his mother to get into the shower, which was unusual. He was sleeping in later. His behavior, he started to babble and almost talk in I guess almost tongues, to
And he
kind
was
of.
5?
He was 5, yeah, and
Oh my God.
he started saying stuff that was like not age appropriate.
Mhm, mhm.
Like we it was funny. He had some blessed medallions, so his mom had some regular stuff on him, like a cross or
Right,
whatever that wasn't blessed, and then she put on some blessed medallions because she was getting concerned. He could actually tell which ones were blessed and which one weren't, and he would take the blessed ones, he'd rip them off and say, "This is from the church," and he'd throw it across the floor. And like, he didn't go to church. Like, the family was Catholic, but they weren't, like, I guess, practicing
right.
Catholic. And then I did some religious provocation, which is when you use religious objects or
Mhm.
scripture to kind of invoke a response. And I was trying to get him to say that he was Jesus and so was his mother, and he couldn't say it. He absolutely refused. And then he told me that I was gay. And again, this is a 5-year-old,
Right.
totally uncharacteristic. He told me that I was gay for loving Jesus, and just like crazy, crazy stuff. So
Right, that a
he,
5-year-old that's not a 5-year-old mentality.
no, and he was like hissing. He began like hissing like a snake, which is also, snake is
Yeah.
representative of Satan and the demonic. Um, and spitting at us, and just crazy, crazy stuff that was totally out of characteristic. And so we called the family priest again, Father Bob Bailey, but unfortunately he wasn't doing deliverance work at that time. So we ended up in a resort to a medium that we knew and trusted, and she came in. She was non-denominational, so she had her sage and her herbs, and
Mhm.
put them in a pie plate and lit them, and started saying her prayers. And then we got up to the master bedroom, and in between Haley and I, so there was Heather was by the window, and then there was a bed, and then we were on the other side of the bed. So the bed was separating the medium and Haley and I, and we all of a sudden Haley and I could feel like this cold spot in between us. And at the time I had the FLIR thermal camera, so I pointed it at the cold spot, and nothing showed up. It wasn't unusual. Um, or anything unusual on the screen, but that's actually common. Like in the paranormal, people report hot spots or cold spots, but the equipment doesn't pick it up. So we mentioned that to the psychic and said, that we feel a cold spot, and the psychic started to call the entity over towards her, and all of a sudden on the bed, we had the FLIR pointed at it. In the middle of the bed, you can see the pie plate, and it's red hot because it's on fire and smoking. But all of a sudden, you can see these distorted footprints start to walk across the comforter as the psychic's calling the entity towards her. And then she said, "I feel like the entity's near me or towards me." And we never told her what we were seeing on the FLIR.
Oh, so
So she,
you had the FLIR, you were looking at it across the other side from her, so she couldn't see. Okay.
yeah, she had no idea any of this was taking place. And so all of a sudden, when the footprints go over to her, she says that she can feel that the entity's over by her. So she said some more non-denominational prayers. I know she did say Michael the Archangel prayer, and then all of a sudden she said that she felt like the entity had gone. And Haley and I looked at each other and said, "Well, we don't feel any different, and we didn't notice or hear anything." And she said, "Well, it's not like the movies, like the windows don't blow out and the roof doesn't come off, and
Right,
you know,
exactly.
papers aren't swirling in the air.
Not the Hollywood version, in other words.
Yeah, and she said, well, all I can tell you is that I feel like the entity's departed. And sure enough, on the floor, the footprints had on the bed cover had disappeared. So it was, it was really interesting. And then after that happened, there's been no activity at the house ever since, and that was November of 2018, I believe.
And was this the medium that you said that afterwards started having her own things going on for her at her house?
No, that wasn't that medium, but it was one of, so there was 3 mediums that were involved in this case. That was one of them. There was another one that was an Arabic fella, and her sister had gone to see him, and he had passed him. He said, "I have a message to pass along to your sister." And she said, "Okay." And she said to tell her that she's got a jinn attached to her, and that this jinn doesn't like other male figures around her, and that he'll make their life a living hell. And that part became important later on because when I was finding out the history of everything she'd been through, there was one day I was at work actually, and so in the morning her daughter would go to school and her son went to pre-primary, so you could either send him in the morning or the afternoon. So she would send him in the afternoon, and her morning routine is to go downstairs, check the cats, and make sure they have water and food. And this one day, she left her phone on the kitchen counter. And so when her son came upstairs, she saw that the phone was lit up. And she thought maybe I had texted her. But when she looked at it, it said somebody had spoken into Surrey. And it said, "Hey, Surrey, Malik, dirty girl." And then the response said, "In my realm, anyone can be anything." And so she took a screenshot of it, sent it to me, and I said, "Okay, that's really strange, right?" So I said, maybe it was the spirit that's been bugging you that kind of, gave you his name, like Malik's a name or whatnot. And I checked the Roman Catholic Bible, and I couldn't find anything in there about Malik. And I checked a few demon dictionaries and couldn't find really anything about Malik. But somehow I ended up piecing it together because when she told me that maybe it's not a demon, it was a jinn, which is also, it can be an angel or a demon. Because in the Quran, jinns are either good or bad, and they can be angels or demons, basically, if you translate it over to Christianity. So I started doing some research and actually found out that Malik is in the Quran, and he's this demon that's in charge of 12 other demons in hell. And Malik's job is to like turn the heat up in hell and kind of torture souls. So we find this out, and then that same morning, about an hour or so later, Haley's little boy brings her a drawing, and it's a stick figure with like these blue swirls around it. So she's kind of like, "Oh, what's this picture of?" And that's really cute. And his response was, "Oh, that's the little boy that likes to play in the fire in my toy room." And so I found that was interesting because we had just read about Malik that likes to crank the fire up in hell, and now an hour later, and he wasn't present for our conversation either, so it wasn't like something kind of subliminal that was put into his mind. So he brings this picture. So then the third thing that happened that day, which again I find interesting because, like I said, the dynamic usually operate in threes, is when it was time to get his clothes for school, and she went upstairs. She kept a statue of the Virgin Mary on the kid's armoire, and it was found face down on the floor, and it never moves from off there. Now that one I kind of put less weight into because, I mean, obviously it's possible the kids bumped into it and knocked it over.
Right.
But the message on the going back to the message on the iPhone. So we had tested 3 other iPhones at the time, and Apple had no explanation for why the iOS software had given the response that was on Haley's phone, because the proper response is when you said that at the time, "Hey Siri, Malik, dirty girl," the proper response should have been, I just don't understand this gender thing. That's what the iOS software was programmed to respond. So Apple had no explanation for why the other
I bet they
response
must have been
came
like,
on. So between that and the drawing from the boy, I mean, I put more weight into that than finding the statue kind of knocked over. But that's that's
did
that's
anything
why I'm.
happen to your daughter at all, or was the target the kid, the boy?
Uh, the boy was a big target towards the end, but actually the first part when I first met the family, it was more targeting the daughter actually.
Okay.
She had there was one morning she woke up. I took a photo of it, and I don't think we might have used it in the book. I can't remember. We tried to protect the identities of the kids as best we could, so
Mhm.
it may be in the book. But if not, I in the file that I have, I took a photo of her eyes because like she hadn't slept for 3 or 4 days. She just had like these terrible like red bags underneath her eyes. Like you could tell this poor kid was just
Right.
exhausted, but there was something that was keeping her up for those 3 days.
So when that medium did that last intervention, that's it. Everything. What happened to the boy? All that
All
behavior.
good. Yeah, yeah. Shortly after that happened, and they weren't there for that either. So the grandparents took the two kids for the night. Well, Haley and myself and the medium dealt with the situation. So, yeah, once that happened, he came back home and he was back to normal. Just a happy little kid.
What a relief! I'm telling you, because when it
Oh,
comes to kids, it's like all bets are off.
yeah, no, for sure. I mean, that's the funny thing too with the dynamic. I mean, they don't care, but even in policing, like the criminals, the hard criminals that are in jail, like that's one thing that's off limits. Like you just don't touch kids, and you know,
Right, exactly. And you know what? That thing that you said about him knowing which metals were blessed or not, I've heard of exorcisms where people sometimes the truth is, you'll have people that claim they're possessed and it's just mental illness, severe mental illness. But anyway, one of the things that they find is they'll put like regular water on them and the person doesn't react, but then they use blessed water or holy water and then they react in pain. And there's no way that person would know, because water is water. In other words,
yeah,
there's no way for them to know which has
yep,
been blessed and which hasn't.
yeah,
And they say that
exactly. It's
that's like
not
a
it's not like
litmus
it's
test to
colored
say,
or
is this real?
yeah. Yeah, it's not like like you said, it's not like it's colored or marked or anything like that. Like if you got sprayed with water and somebody's telling you that it's blessed, I mean, you would assume that it's blessed.
Right, exactly. If you have a priest or somebody that's in let's say a part of the exorcism team is throwing water on you, let's say the person, even if they're crazy, is going to assume that the water is going to be blessed. But
Yeah,
when they
yeah,
don't react, but then you use the real one, that's your first tip that, yeah, you are really dealing with some type of, something's going on with that person on the supernatural end of it. And
yeah, yeah.
when you mentioned that thing about that medium, I read one time there's a psychiatrist, his name is Dr. Gallagher. And
Oh yes, yep.
you've heard of Dr. Gallagher, that he works with the
Yes, yeah,
exorcisms and everything?
he's a psychiatrist, but
Right.
he's got a real fascination with the dynamic, and yeah,
Right,
actually,
right,
I think
right.
he actually has
He
membership.
kind of went into it. You could tell that he says he kind of went into it thinking he never had a proclivity to think, but he says that after he witnessed certain events, like he said that there's just no way this person could know what was happening. But I don't. One time he was telling the story. This was another psychiatrist, and it was a team, a man and a woman, and they were treating this lady that she had gone through all types of therapies. Nothing was working. She was really troubled. So they start working with her. And after a few months, they stopped because they said, we're not making any headway. Come to find out after the fact, it's incredible. They both describe that unknown to the other, they started having at their houses things fall off shelves, noises, and they would get splitting headaches. both of them were having the same experiences at their houses outside of the time that they were working with his patient. And they never shared that. I guess each one thought was at the beginning it was a random, and then after a while where they saw a pattern, but it was like what you said, I'm not going to talk about this because I'm supposed to be a medical professional who doesn't believe in the supernatural.
Yeah. Actually, I just heard Dr. Gallagher on a friend of mine's podcast, and it was interesting because I think the question came up: what do other psychiatrists think of your interest in the dynamic? And he's kind of like me now, but he said that he doesn't, sure, he gets some ridicule and stuff like that, but he doesn't care. And
Right.
you could tell he's the work that he's done. He's a believer in it for sure. So it's his work's fascinating.
Right, but the thing is that when you, in other words, he's not ready to just everything is a case of possession for him. Basically, he's part of that team to basically identify. No, this person is not possessed. This person just needs mental health treatment or some type of drug intervention. But some of the things that he's described through the years, because he's been doing that for quite some time. It's very convincing, by the way. It's very convincing when you read about what he's witnessed, and he says that in some cases he's had patients slash possession subjects know things about him personally.
Yeah.
That there's no way this person would know anything about me at all, period, much less things that were going on personally for me in my family or my personal life.
Yeah, and that's one of the signs of a person that's possessed is they have that foreknowledge or the future knowledge. They're able to tell things that they shouldn't know. So yeah, that's really interesting.
It's very. Let me tell you something. When you read those stories coming from somebody like him, it's more. It's like if you ever have any doubt in you, like how much of that is real, it'll make a believer out of you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you got to check his work out for sure if you're not familiar with him.
Yes, I think he came out with a book a couple of years ago. I want to say one of his last books came out a couple of years ago. So let me ask you now, this second book that you brought out, and I want to say, when you, and I know you were law enforcement yourself, what do you feel is, because I know a lot of people will have firsthand experiences and they still have it, but they still become doubters. What have you found with some of the people that you interviewed for the second book? What's happened to them after they have a paranormal experience?
Some of them are certainly believers for sure. I'm trying to think of the skeptical ones. I think in the second book I noticed, although they were skeptical, they still believe that the incident that they experienced was supernatural. There wasn't any. I don't think in the second book there was anyone that was like absolutely adamant that they're not sure what that was, kind of thing. Whereas in the first book there was a couple of stories that people weren't sure.
And let me ask you something, Elliott. There's a book, and unfortunately I lost my copy of it. One of those things that you could kick yourself because it came out in the 1980s.
Oh no!
And I found it randomly, and then it was a great book, and then later on you realize how good of a book it was because it dealt with police officers coming on crime scenes with occult symbolism and not realizing what it was. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, they're looking at all the clues, but they don't realize that some of the things that are there are basically pointing at some type of occult or cultish, if you want to call it motivators. That a lot of that stuff is symbolic.
Yeah.
Did you ever come across any of that when you worked in the police department?
No. You know what? I can say I never had like an occult type murder or anything like that. I think even even like the closest thing I could even think of is I investigated a break and enter one time where the guy had set it up to hire two teenage kids, of course, go break into his mother's house and steal a bunch of jewelry because he didn't get along with his mother. And I was able to get information through a confidential source or a human source or informant, or I guess it's the bad guys like to call it a snitch. But I was able to get information on who did it, and of course I ripped the two kids in for an interview first, and of course they admit to everything, right, because they're scared, and they put up this guy to it, and this guy, I could picture him being involved in the occult. We didn't find anything in his house when we did a warrant except for stolen property, but he wore like those kind of like rings, like almost like a devil worshiper type ring.
Right.
Had like the black coat. In his house, he had like strange knives. Almost looked like ceremonial type knives, but there was nothing like completely blatant, like any sort of literature, books, and statues or anything like that. But those. I know California gets quite a bit of those.
Right, and the way. The book was really interesting because basically he was the author was trying to say that they needed to train police departments better to recognize certain things, because in other words, it's not like every crime you got to has got black candles and a dead animal, like, hey, that there were more subtle symbology. He said 9 times out of 10 they're a murder, some type of murder scene. He says where they leave certain types of symbols or something there that if you know what you're looking at, you realize, as far as if you're trying to find who the perpetrator is, but if you don't know what you're seeing, you overlook it. And especially if it's a stranger on stranger crime, because sometimes those are, there's not like that you could say, well, it's the husband or the friend or the neighbor, there's a connection, and sometimes you can follow it back. But when it's a stranger on stranger, there's just no. And I'm going to give you an example. This happened, I want to say it's maybe less than 10 years ago in Miami, and they have a bay off Miami, Biscayne Bay. They found a young man dismembered. Okay.
Yeah.
In a bag. They threw him in the bay. Okay. His brother came and identified him, etc. Turns out this guy was a day laborer, and not really no enemies. He was a young guy. He was like in his early 20s, day laborer, didn't have any enemies. And what happened was, it was like a Friday night, and he went drinking with his brother, and then went to some places, and unfortunately drank too much. And his brother says, "Hey, I'm leaving." And he goes, "Oh, I'm going to leave later." His brother leaves, and he staggers out, of the bar. And apparently, it's like 2 or 3 in the morning. The streets are empty.
Yeah.
But he says that they remember seeing him. In other words, they remember seeing, somebody said that they saw him being put into, I can't remember, it was a trunk or the back seat of like an older model Honda. Okay. And they drive away with him. And then the next thing you know is he's found dismembered in the bay. And the point that they were saying is, if it was robbery, all they had to do, he was so drunk that they could have gone through his pockets and robbed him. You didn't have to take him anywhere. But they were saying that most probably this guy was used as a sacrifice. Okay. Because he was found within less than a week. In other words, when he was taken, he was, they killed him like right away. And that's why I'm saying that a lot of times, in other words, this was not a mob hit. This wasn't like a guy, who's like, oh, he's in organized crime and they were trying to make an example. One of these convoluted things that you can say, okay, this was a guy who's a day laborer, gets too drunk, young, good-looking guy. 2 guys hustle him into a car, drive off with him. The next thing you know, he shows up in a bag floating in the bay. And that's my point as far as some of these stranger on stranger crimes, that it's so difficult that unless you know what you're looking for, if you find a crime scene, that I think that's fascinating, because I think sometimes not that's coming to light more. Besides the obvious stuff, like you said, that you find paraphernalia, you go to the perpetrator and he's got books and he's got, all this maybe satanic, stuff, and you can say, okay, well, that's the maybe he's trying to do something along those lines. But I was wondering, because I always think that I've heard some stories of people saying after the fact, I remember going to some place and there was some weird stuff, like there was a cow tongue nailed to the door, or the wall, things like that, really weird stuff like that. Like,
yeah, no, that's a really good point for sure.
It's
and of course,
there's
I can see how cases go cold, because
Mhm.
luckily in my career, when I was on homicide, there was one case. There was one case for sure that we knew who did it, but we didn't have enough to lay charges. But other than that, most of the cases were solved. But there was one case where I call it a circle. And so what happens is, like, when there's a homicide, you start with the body, you got to find out who it is, and then you got to work backwards. Where was this person at? Who was this person with? Who's this person's friends, associates? And you kind of work way backwards. And then there's kind of a circle. So you start interviewing everyone, like family, friends, associates. Maybe he was found outside of a business, so you interview the business owner and the employees and things like that. But eventually you start to come full circle, where they're like, talk to so-and-so. Oh, we already talked to so-and-so. Or talk to Jane Doe. Oh, we haven't talked to Jane Doe. So then you go talk to Jane Doe. But eventually you come to the part where you've talked to everyone. So everyone's saying, oh, I don't know, you might want to talk to this person. Well, police already talked to this person. So eventually you run out. But normally at the end of that circle, your case is done. You know who the suspect is. And you've got everything that you need. But in a whodunit case where you don't know who did it, once you empty that circle, like, you got nowhere to go. So I can see how easy it is for a case to go cold and you not have very much solving it. Luckily, in the case that I worked, DNA solved it. So we did finish that circle. There was no one else to talk to. We had all the video surveillance from downtown. We had nothing. But luckily for us, they found DNA on the victim's body. And 6 months later, once the lab analyzed some items that we had sent from the crime scene to the lab, the offender's DNA was on the data bank. So they were able to make a link of the offender to the victim. And we picked him up and he confessed to it. And now he's in jail. So we were very lucky in that case. But it's kind of scary as a homicide detective when you reach that point, because when you have nowhere else to go to get your information, it's pretty scary, because you're left with that cold case, and no one wants to be the guy that's working that cold case.
Right. Well, DNA, God, it's solving. I know some cold cases have finally found resolution because of DNA, that there's a match eventually, even though it happened years before, if they kept some type of evidence, if it could be used. And
Yes,
let me ask you, just like those people that don't have enemies, I imagine, what about those people who have a lot of enemies? It's like, okay, who would have a motive to kill this person? Well, you've got thousands.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, there are some people that are just so entrenched in the criminal underworld that
Right, exactly.
Yeah, if they got killed, there'd probably be 100 suspects, because everyone wants to take them out. So
yeah, like, who'd want to do away with this guy? Well, okay, he double crossed a lot of people, or he did a lot of bad things, and that people don't realize that sometimes, and I'm glad you know, because sometimes you always hear about some of these hauntings that are tied to the violent death, or the no justice for the victim. Okay. Where it's almost like that's what they're waiting for, or that nobody knows what became of them. They do away with somebody, and nobody ever knows that somebody did away with them. They just drop off the face of the earth, and that sometimes is the trigger for an intelligent haunting, because they want to let somebody know, hey, this is what happened and this is who did it to me. And I tell people sometimes, when you get, these hauntings that are either a piece of land or like you said, or you'll get a structure there, brand new apartment building or house or whatever. And they start having all these things. I go, you never know who might have been buried out there in the dead of night a few years ago, that they got rid of.
Yeah, that's true. And that's the thing too. Like, even if you do research on a property and you're not getting anything from local records, it doesn't mean that something didn't happen there. Especially in early days, record keeping wasn't exactly, the best. So you could do research on the property. There's nothing there, but something could have happened that you just don't know about.
Right. Well, there was in Texas, the place was called Black Oaks. I can't remember, but right after American Civil War, like around the turn of the century, there was a Black community and it had a cemetery. There was a big fire in the town, and basically everybody moved away. And of course, this cemetery was an unofficial cemetery. In other words, it wasn't ever put into the county records. It was just part of the community where they're burying the dead. And years pass, a developer buys the land, unknowing themselves. It's not like that movie Poltergeist, where the developer knowingly builds on top of the graveyard. They have no idea that this graveyard was there to begin with, because of course a lot of those monuments back then were made of wood, and they decay and they disappear. And then it was one of these developments where people paid to have like a customized home on a piece of land, and it was in an area. And soon enough, people started to experience hauntings, and how they started having things happening, and everybody was like, "What's going on? This is a brand new house." And how they came to find out was one of them, after the fact, after they had moved in, was digging a pool.
Oh, yes.
In their backyard. And they came up and they brought up two wooden coffins.
Wow.
And I believe they were able to identify because they still had the rings. People would get buried with their rings and their jewelry on. And it was a couple that had been buried, like I want to say 1910, 1905, something like that. Because this happened in the 70s in Texas. It was like, and that's how they started to unravel what had been in this piece of land previously.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah,
and they
almost sounds like the plot line to Poltergeist.
Well, and then what ended up happening is these homeowners are trying to get their money back. Basically, like, I want to move out of here because I wouldn't have bought this house or this piece of land if I would have known it's being buried. But
absolutely,
they got caught in one of these back and forward things, and they're being told you can't. In other words, provide proof, but you can't dig up, because it was one of those things where the law catches you on a back and forth. You need proof, but they don't allow you to do what you need to get the proof. And one of the family, one of the main ones, they decided, we're going to dig ourselves. And one time the mother and the daughter, and they're digging, they're trying to find more proof. And the mom says she starts getting like really like all of a sudden I'm really tired. Like, oh my God. She sits down, and her daughter, who's like 30, 31 years old, starts digging in the place, doing the work. All of a sudden she collapses. Make a long story short, she dies. She has a heart attack. She died. The family, the parents, they basically gave the house back to the bank. Like, they couldn't win and they moved away. But all the families, God, I could kick myself for not remembering the name of that place. And they wrote a book about it later on. But everybody in that area had some type of experience, and it was because they all had basically built. And she says that one of the times, she says that they had a very old oak tree in the backyard, and something was carved into it with an arrow pointing down. She says that they couldn't figure out, all right, somebody carved an arrow pointing down, and they were like, okay, whatever. Turns out that basically it was like a marker, in the middle of the cemetery that somebody, was just pointing down as in so-and-so's buried here, but there was nothing there. And at the time they saw it, they couldn't put two and two together till much later.
I'll have to do some research on this because I mean you always hear so many different stories, but this one sounds really fascinating. And some of the older stories I just love digging into, so I'll have to definitely do some research on that.
Yeah, it's and this was by the way, when this happened, because I now remember it was the Black Hope Cemetery. That's it. There we go. I hate it when I can't remember. Black Hope Cemetery in Texas. And this, by the way, this happened prior to Poltergeist, because I know there's people that are going to say, oh, you know what? They ran with the idea of the Poltergeist movie, where the people are buried. And this happened prior to that. And basically everybody, I think it was like 8 homeowners that had built in this parcel, all ended up moving away. All of them. None of them could stay. Wow. Very, very interesting and very sad what happened to the one family that wrote the book about their daughter collapsing and dying. By the time she reached the hospital, she was dead. She had like this major heart attack, something that she was pronounced when she got to the hospital. And by the way, she didn't have any health problems. That
you know what?
You exerted yourself too much.
When you were telling that story, I just gave it a super quick Google here. When you were telling that story, I was like, I know, like I felt like I had ESP or a premonition that you were going to tell me that the daughter took a heart attack. And I'm like, my God, it's like either I'm having deja vu or that sounds familiar. But Unsolved Mysteries did an episode on this.
Really?
And yes, and I remember it now. Yeah, I'll definitely have to do, because I would have been a kid when I saw that. So
well, let me tell you, there's much more than what they publicize. So if you read and you go into, there's a lot of details, like most of these things, but sometimes they compress these into shows like to a half hour or a 1 hour thing. And there's, in other words, the duration of what happened and how it happened and the aftermath for these families.
I'll have to do some research on it for sure.
It's very, very, very interesting. That getting back to the original point, which what I was saying, that sometimes where you see land, like how did it happen? Sometimes it's not a cemetery. Sometimes it's been a dumping ground for bodies. Yeah,
absolutely. Happened. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why a lot of sanitariums and institutions are haunted, because if you actually look at the history of it, like the patients were treated almost like prisoners, and they were beaten and they were made to do slave labor. Some of them ran crops, like they had to like pick fruit and pick vegetables and they'd sell it to help fund the hospital. And when they died, a lot of them would just toss them in the ground.
What people don't realize, a lot of people don't know about it. It's even worse than that. They said not everybody, but I want to say 90%, like you said, of these patients, when they died, they usually had a cemetery, like a hospital cemetery.
Some did, yeah, you're right.
Majority of the families never came to claim the bodies, but because those big giant asylums came around like after, at least in the United States, after the Civil War, and like you said, there wasn't like that you have the state funding. Now it was like they had like working farms. That's the only way they could keep it going. And what they would do, this was around the time that they needed bodies for the anatomy classes. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of the patients that ended up dying there, their bodies were given over to these different universities, to their anatomy classes, because there was no family to come and say, hey, where's my father? Where's my mother, my brother, my uncle, my kid? Because the families by that time, they were, especially if the person was very violent or their mental illness was really difficult to control. They weren't visiting. So a lot of these, believe it or not, a lot of these asylums would turn around and sell these bodies.
Wow.
For use, knowing that no family member was going to come and take it. Nobody was going to come and find out, what did you do with that body?
I could totally see that for sure. Yeah. Because like you said, it's really sad, but some people would just drop their kid off at that hospital. And that was it. See you later. Never see them again.
Yes. And everybody was put in there together. People don't realize that It wasn't just the mentally ill. If you were indigent, if you had fallen on hard times, everybody was lumped in there together.
Yeah,
And
they
horrific
put
things
senior
happened.
they put senior citizens in there. If people couldn't afford to put them in proper guest homes, they dropped them off at the asylum. Just say,
Yes,
see you later.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. It was when you look at it, especially when you look at it from the modern day perspective. Some of these things, and I want to say, unfortunately, because of the nature of the work, they were short staffed. And then, let's face it, they didn't look hard at who they hired because they were just so desperate to get sometimes, people to work there. That's when you start hearing. But even amongst themselves, there was a lot of violence among the people that were, that were not so violent that they had to be kept like in the padded room, that were basically left. They were very violent amongst themselves. And it's but yeah, again, when there's nobody there to be your advocate, as in a family member or a friend, a lot of those bodies ended up being given over or sold. I take that back, sold over, because there was always a profit in the process to universities for the medical schools. Yep.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know, or I didn't consider that part, but I mean, it makes total sense.
Yeah, of course. And, not everybody that died, or because some people, they had all the different ages, different sexes, whatever it was that these universities needed. And the thing is, people don't realize back then it wasn't like that you could keep, in other words, these corpses would decompose really quick. They needed a lot. In other words, I mean, I understand the thought why they wanted it. Do you see what I'm saying? But it's different when it's somebody that says, "Okay, use my body," versus.
No, for sure. Yeah, I mean, like, some people donate their body to science, but obviously these poor souls didn't have a choice.
No. They were. There was a profit to be made, and it's like nobody's gonna come and say, "Hey, that little." And if you go to some of these cemeteries at these asylums, all they even have is just a little slab with like a number. If you can find the marker, it's very deep, no personalization, nothing like that of that nature. But yeah, absolutely, asylums, especially those old ones, it's like, it's not if it's haunted, it's like how bad.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, they are. Elliott, I want to thank you so much. It has been wonderful to speak to you. Just for my podcast listeners, what is the website that they can find you at?
You know what? The best website to find anything out about myself or paranormal phenomena research investigation is ppri.net. That stands for Paranormal Phenomena Research Investigation.net. It's got my biography on there. It's got a store section which will give you links to Amazon or Chapters or Barnes and Noble where you can find my books at. It's got some parapsychological articles on there. Just a very good resource. So ppri.net.
And you said next month, as in October, is when your book is being released?
Yeah, I'm hoping towards the end of October. It's just at the editor right now, being edited, but hoping for the end of October, and that one will be called "More Supernatural Encounters from Law Enforcement." And again, it'll be available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble's website, and if you're in Canada, Chapters Indigo Cole's website.
Excellent. I will put a link to your website on the credits of the show. And again, I want to thank you. Yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful to talk to you, and I hope you'll come back and we can talk about more of your stories because they're fascinating.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And thank you for having me. I enjoy doing these.
On the contrary, it was my pleasure. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, guys, wasn't it an interesting conversation? God. See, I want to bring him back so we could fill us in on the other stories. Because the truth is that, a lot of times, and I've said this before, a lot of these people, as a matter of fact, they're trained observers, they're silenced, and with good reason. I do the same thing. If you think that your job or your chances of promotion Or, I mean, one thing is to say, hey, did you see that was a weird stuff? Yeah, okay. But if you keep on digging into it, or you keep on like becoming known as that person, after a while it can follow you around. And even now, even though paranormal research and all that has become more mainstream, it will be a career killer. And nobody's going to come unless you have a really good boss and tell you, hey, but if he becomes, how can I tell you, known that you're that person who's into that weird shit, believe it or not, people remember. Then if there's any talk about promotions, or you'd be surprised, people, that will come up. People say, no. I go, yeah, that comes up. And sometimes if it's down to you and another person being considered, guess what? That might be the one thing that is sways the balance in favor of your rival for promotion, for this, for that. I mean, for a million things. And I've heard that some version of that from people across the board: cops, 911, fire chiefs, pilots. Something where, especially where what you do is you're supposed to be very fact-based, rational. In other words, somebody that the job description demands that you have a really, really, really good grip on reality. Okay, because they don't want anybody, and you might think, well, just because you believe in something, to them it will have a whiff of how much of a grip do you have in reality? Because if something ever goes south with you, as in that person, somebody will bring up and go, see, why did you give that guy that promotion? Or why did you give that person? See, he was weird. He was always walking around talking about ghosts and stuff. And see, nobody wants to be the one that gave the okay for that promotion or for that assignment, whatever the case might be. So yeah, I've spoken to innumerable people, God, that say, yeah, I've seen this, I've heard that once, a lot of times. We've arrived at accident scenes, like that one that I said about the 911 calls, things at the police station. And everybody just sees it. Yeah, but that's it. It's like, let's not talk about that anymore, because of the stigma that's attached to it. And it's really funny, because sometimes the ones that say the most, they don't believe in it, are the ones that are the most scared of it. It's almost like by saying, if I say enough that I don't believe in it, then I'm going to be off the. If I don't believe in it, it's not real. It's not going to happen. It's like their denial is going to save them from either witnessing it or anything like that. It's like, this is my talisman. My disbelief will protect me. Yeah. Yes, that happens quite a lot. And there's even in that that one that I said the story about, where the dispatcher was found outside one night, dispatching from outside on one of those handheld radios, because at night it was a lot slower. She could do that. It was because the station was built in the 1940s, and it used to have one of those really old cells, like those heavy metal clank. Like, in other words, I went there, I investigated it. And if you went back there, it had those old-fashioned cells that are heavy metal, and you do anything and you open that door and you hear clank, clank, it made a bunch of noise. And since that station was on the small side, it wasn't like this was like a holding cell. And whoever was there at night, sometimes there was occasions where they would hear clanking in that cell back there. It was like a room, and then inside the room was that cell. And they would hear the clanking of either the door opening or closing, or somebody in there. And there was nothing in there for it to clank, unless there was somebody, but there wasn't anybody. Okay. And by the way, the noise was unmistakable. It was nothing else in that building or in that office or in that area that sounded like that. It was a very distinctive noise. All right. And now, as to who it was, they really had to, I asked, did you ever have any prisoner commit suicide? Anything happen in here? Or maybe fights between two people? Nothing that they knew of, but it was like, there was nothing there that, as far as nothing that they could say this event happened in there, and maybe it's either a residual, maybe something that is just playing out, or this really horrific, it was a murder, or somebody hung himself, or two guys had it out, nothing that could be pinned as to who was in there making all that noise inside the jail cell of all things. So let me tell you something. Things like that make you realize that there's a lot of stuff out there that sometimes, like I said, you could try to explain it, and sometimes you'll never have an adequate explanation. Why do some places become haunted, others not? Why do some spirits haunt and others not? Why do some deceased go on their way and make it to the other side and that's it? And others don't. Some people say religious beliefs, lack of religious beliefs, fear of hell, the need for vengeance, the need for somebody knowing maybe what happened to them. You also have people that are very materialistic. They want to basically they're very tied to the earth plane, I guess is how I'm trying to say it, of what they have, because that's the kind of person they were in life. And it's like that part of moving on is that you got to let go of all that stuff, and they can't. But why some and why others, and things of that nature. A lot of interesting questions. But anyway, guys, I want to thank you for being part of my audience. Again, I just released my book. It's out on Amazon right now. If you look up Hot Dame on a Cold Slab, Film Noir Murders #2, you will find it there in Amazon under Marlene Pardo Pellicer. Again, I told everybody that between now and October 31st, Halloween, anybody that signs up to my newsletter, that you can do by going to my website, marlenepardo.com or miamighostchronicles.com. I will send you a free PDF copy of the book. All right. And again, we're on track to doing the Halloween live stream between me and my hubby. All right. And like I said, we will be talking all things paranormal. I'll probably once we get closer to the actual date, I'm going to probably give out a number so people could call in and text me questions, so I can get some questions ready. And then, we'll have the chat going, but at the same time, I'll have some questions lined up, and we'll talk. Hey, whatever makes your weird little heart happy, we'll talk about that. So again, thank you for being part of my audience. Come back next week and the week after and the week after, because I have a great list of guests coming on with a lot of interesting things to talk about. So till then, take care.